The qualitative research approach. This chapter focuses on data that is collected in words, diagrams, illustrations, pictures, and stories. The qualitative approach is embedded within the interpretive way of thinking and viewing the world. The interpretive method or quantitative approach is conducted from an experience perspective in that the researcher does not start with concepts determined prior, but rather seeks to allow these to emerge from encounters in the field. What is the interpretive way of thinking? The interpretive research approach states that reality is defined by the research participants' interpretation of their own realities. It is a subjective reality rather than an objective one. The main difference between quantitative approach and qualitative approach is the data collection methods. Numbers versus words. The qualitative approach believes the only true way to find out about the subjective reality of participants is to ask them for their own interpretations. Data does not always equal the same thing as information. Information is something you get from the data once it has been analyzed. The information is how we interpret the facts. The data is the facts we actually collect. One reality versus many. As positivists, or quantitative researchers, the belief that a single reality which is not changed by the observation is paramount. As an interpretive researcher or qualitative researcher, there are many different realities experienced by many people, and to get at the heart of those experiences, a relationship must exist during the data collection process. In any study involving human participants, there will be three realities: the researcher's reality, the participant's reality, and the mutual reality between the researcher and the participant. These realities are always changing as the study proceeds deeper into and the relationships begin to form. Subject versus research participants. The qualitative approach focuses on individual experiences who are active in the data collection, whereas the quantitative approach plays more of a passive role. Researcher values. In Chapter 2, we discuss value awareness, or the ability to put your own values aside when conducting research. A qualitative researcher acknowledges their values and explores how their values shape both their experiences and the outcomes. Commonalities of qualitative research studies will be reviewed in the next slide. The commonalities for a qualitative research study are that it's conducted in a natural setting, that the variables cannot be controlled or manipulated, the research questions are not always completely conceptualized at the start of the investigation, and the outcomes of the data collected are more natural and not reduced to numbers. A qualitative method for gathering data in which the natural social processes are studied as they happen in the field, rather than a laboratory or left relatively undisturbed. Observing and interacting with subjects in the course of their normal activities. It avoids artificiality of experiments and the structured questioning of surveys. The context of what the participants are explaining is much better understood. This diagram outlines the phases with the qualitative method. The bold arrows indicate phases that interact with each other. Note, in a quantitative study, the literature is utilized within the first three steps. In a qualitative approach, the literature is reviewed in all phases. To explain the phases, let's look at an example study that was interested in evaluating racial discrimination in social services. Based on observations had by the researcher, ethnic minorities outnumber ethnic majority in seeking assistance from social services. The researcher decided to review the literature and based on key concepts from the observations. The knowledge gained from the review of the literature helps the researcher develop a meaningful understanding of the problem, and then can develop a research question based on the gaps in the literature. This is phase 1 and 2. The research question for this example study will be, do ethnic minorities have difficulty in accessing social services? The next step is to design the study by selecting the qualitative approach. Several qualitative approaches will be further explored in later slides. For this particular example, the researcher selected the case study approach to explain social phenomena that is occurring. This case study will focus on the lived experiences of minority individuals and social services they have access to. The next phase is to collect the data. To collect data for this case study, the researcher decided to use interviews as the primary data collection method. Prior to conducting interviews, the researcher immersed themselves within the social service settings to truly understand what it's like to be a client. This experience was used to both to guide both the formation of the potential interview questions, the interview itself, and the data analysis. The next step is to analyze and interpret the data. In the first round of interviews, the researcher interviewed many ethnic minority clients about their perceptions of racial discrimination within social services. The researcher then used the transcripts of the interviews to organize the information into commonalities based on responses. For this example, the researcher was able to determine that many of the minority clients say they must give up their social identity to receive social services. Findings are nested within the context of the lived experiences of the individuals interviewed. The findings must be presented in a way that tells a meaningful story about these experiences with the hope that changes can be made to improve these experiences. According to the text, qualitative research expands the range of knowledge of the world beyond the researchers themselves and helps really see the what and the why rather than just to be able to explain the what. So the advantages of qualitative research are it accounts for the complexity of group behaviors, it reveals interrelationships among multifaceted dimensions of group interactions, it provides context for behaviors, it reveals qualities of the group experience in a way that other forms of research simply cannot. It helps determine questions and types of follow-up research. It reveals descriptions of behavior and context by stepping outside the group. And finally, it allows qualitative researchers to identify recurring patterns of behavior that participants may be unable to recognize themselves. The disadvantages of qualitative researcher is the researcher bias can always bias the study. Because they're embedded within the study, there's always going to be a bias that may enter both the design and the data collection of the study. Sources or subjects may not always be equally credible. Because we rely on so few participants, they may not always be the most credible that we were able to get to participate in our study. Some subjects may be previously influenced and affected by the outcomes of the study. Background information may be missing. The study group may not be representative of the larger population. Analysis of observation can be biased. Any group that is studied is altered to some degree by the presence of the researcher. Therefore, any data collected is somewhat skewed, and we'll talk about your role when you collect that data in later slides. It takes time to build trust with participants that facilitates full and honest self-representation. Short-term observational studies are at a particular disadvantage where trust building is concerned, and as an undergrad or a graduate student, these short-term observational studies are pretty common. It takes a lot more resources to be able to do long-term studies. There are 5 traditional qualitative research approaches that will be discussed over the next several slides. These approaches are a biography or life history or oral history, phenomenology, which is a lived experience, grounded theory, ethnography, and case study. Biographical study, the study of an individual and his or her experiences as told by the researcher or found in documents and archival material. It's a life history, the study of an individual's life and how it reflects cultural themes of the society. An example of a qualitative biography is some biographical research in social work may be conceived in many ways. However, typically the topic constitutes the study of a single life, focusing primarily upon an individual who in some way is affiliated with the professional field of social work, like the biography of a social worker in an urban school setting. For the oral history, the researcher gathers personal recollections of events, their causes, their effects, and the individual or from several individuals. The researcher needs to collect an extensive information about the subject of the biography. The writer, using an interpretive approach, needs to be able to bring him or herself into the narrative and acknowledge his or her standpoint. Phenomenology describes the meaning of the lived experiences about a concept or a phenomenon for several individuals. Its purpose is to determine what an experience means for the persons who have experienced it and are able to provide a comprehensive description of it. From the individual descriptions, general or universal meanings are derived. In other words, the essence of the structures of the experience. An example of a phenomenology was a study conducted by Carl Erickson on the experiences of empathy among social workers working with forced migrants. The purpose of the study was to understand phenomenology of empathy with a qualitative approach. The study was conducted by studying the experiences of empathy among 5 social workers who, in different ways, met forced migrants in their work. Grounded theory is based on symbolic interactionism, which posits that humans act and interact on the basis of symbols, which have meaning and value for the actors. The intent of grounded theory is to generate or discover a theory that relates to a particular situation. If little is known about a topic, grounded theory is especially useful. You usually have a question, doesn't do a literature review in the beginning. It usually has 20 to 30 interviews, maybe more than one time for each person. In grounded theory, data analysis generates a visual picture, a narrative statement, or a series of hypotheses with a central phenomenon, causal conditions, context, and consequences. The researcher needs to set aside theoretical ideas or notions so that analytical or substantive theories can emerge from the data. Aon and Eisenberg used grounded theory to understand the role of cultural values and expectations in the development of working relationships between Mexican-American parents and child welfare workers. These researchers identified 3 factors perceived by both the parents and the workers. Using this information gained, the researchers were able to construct a model that identifies the factors that hinder the relationship formation. This research took general concepts and found a plausible relationship. An ethnography is a description and interpretation of a culture or social group or system. The researcher examines the group's observable and learned patterns of behavior, their customs, and their way of life. It involves prolonged observations of the group, typically through participant observation. It needs extensive time to collect data. Many ethnographies may be written in a narrative or storytelling approach, which may be difficult for the audience accustomed to the usual social science writing. An example of an ethnography is from Elijah Anderson's research that examines an unwritten set of rules that exist within an inner-city community. He then delineates the code and examines it as a response to the lack of jobs that pay a living wage, to the stigma of race, the rampant drug use, and the alienation and lack of hope. Because inner-city Black America is often stereotyped as a place of random violence, the violence, in fact, in the inner city is regulated through an informal but well-known code of the street. This unwritten set of rules, based largely on the individual's ability to command respect, is a powerful and persuasive form of etiquette, governing the way in which people learn to negotiate public spaces. A case study is an exploration of a bounded system, or a case or multiple cases over time through detailed, in-depth data collection involving multiple sources of information, rich in context. The context of the cases involves situating the cases within its setting, which may be physical, social, historical, and/or economic. For a case study, data collection strategies include direct observation, interviews, documents, archival records, participant observation, physical artifacts, and audiovisual materials. The analysis of themes or issues and interpretation of the case study by the researcher. An example of a case study is Diamond's 1992 research on nursing home. Diamond's research required him to become an active participant in the social setting for which his study was designed. Diamond spent over a year working as an aide in the nursing home. He began with an exploratory research question and then developed a general concepts that he was making sense of his observations. He was able to use case study to explore human experiences in depth and carefully analyze the social context for which these events occurred. Participant observation is a method in which the natural social processes are studied as they happen in the field rather than in a laboratory and left relatively undisturbed. It represents a continuum of roles ranging from a complete observer who does not participate in group activities and is publicly defined as the researcher, or a covert participant who acts just like other group members and does not disclose his or her research role. We will discuss each of these in more depth in the next several slides. Participant observation, possible roles. The first concern as a researcher deciding on what role to assume is it is important to decide whether or not to reveal your role as a researcher. This decision must take into account the specific of the social situation being studied, the researcher's background and personality, and any ethical concerns. Complete observation. It's more focused over time as the observer develops a sense of the important categories of people and activities and gradually develops a theory that accounts for what is being observed. Reactive effects can occur if the observer announces to the people who are being observed what is actually happening. The introduction may alter their behaviors. In complete observation, we try to see things as they happen without actively participating in these events. For participant observation, the advantage of this role is the group members know the researcher's real role, allowing them to keep information hidden from the researcher, and the researcher can decline to participate in any unethical or dangerous activities without fear of exposing his or her identity. To participate in enough group activities to develop rapport with the members and gain a direct sense of what group members experience. The final is covert participation. Covert participation is keeping the research secret. You act like other participants in the social setting or group. The reactive effects that may occur if a researcher's role is announced to the group is lessened by this type of participation. There are many ethical concerns with this type of role because of the possible unintended consequences that result in covert participation. Through participant observation, you need to enter the field. It's a critical stage, which finding a participant who can make introductions is important. That getting formal permission may also be required. You must be sensitive to the impression you make, you must be sensitive to the ties you establish when entering the field, and it lays the groundwork for collecting data. Entering the field is a critical stage in participant observation project, and some background work is essential to develop a clear understanding of what the research questions are likely to be and evaluate how the researcher's values may influence the people and the problems that are encountered. In participant observation, developing and maintaining relationships is critical. Researchers must be careful to manage their relationships in the research setting so they can continue to interview members within the social setting. Every action the researcher takes can develop or undermine this relationship. Interaction early in the research process is particularly sensitive because the participants don't know the researcher and the researcher doesn't know the routines. So how do we maintain the relationships? The following suggestions may assist the researcher in maintaining relationships in the field. Develop a plausible and honest explanation for yourself and the study. Maintain the support of key individuals in the group or organizations under the study. Be unobtrusive and unassuming. Don't be too aggressive in questioning others. And most importantly, be a reflective listener. Some other suggestions for maintaining the relationship are ask sensitive questions only of informants from whom your relationship is good. Be self-revealing, but only up to a point. Don't tell them too much about yourself. Don't fake your social similarity with your subjects. Avoid giving or receiving monetary or other tangible gifts, but without violating norms of reciprocity. Be prepared for special difficulties and tensions if multiple groups are involved. So in participant observation, how do we sample people and events? In deciding to sample people or places, qualitative researchers may have to limit their sample to a handful of places, programs, or people so they can focus all the attention on the social dynamics of those settings. To ensure these limitations do not impact outcomes, the sample must be appropriate and adequate for the study, even if it's not representative. It may select one or more critical cases. Studying more than one case or setting almost always strengthens the causal conclusions and makes the finding more generalizable, but with funding and time, it's not always feasible. Notes are the primary means of recording participant observation data. There are several different effective methods that can be used in this process, generally dependent upon the researcher's role in the social setting. It's the primary means of recording participant observation data: jottings, brief partial notes while observing; field notes, in which we use jottings as memory joggers and write up more complete notes on a daily basis. Computerized text can be used and expected for organization after those notes are printed out. Writing up the notes does take much longer, sometimes as much as 3 times longer, than the actual observing did, so we have to prepare for that time that's needed. The following slide details the basic information that should be collected during participant observation. We should include descriptions of the methodology we're using, where the researcher was standing or sitting while they were observing, how they chose people for conversation observations, what counts of the people or events they made and why, a record of the researcher's feelings and thoughts while observing. May be supplemented by still pictures, videotapes, and printed materials circulated or posted in the research setting that's being observed. A systematic observation is a research study that develops a standard form in which to record variation with the observed setting in terms of the variables of interest. Those variables might include how often some behaviors are occurring or frequency, particular people being observed, maybe the environmental conditions. Shapiro and Mangeldorf in 1994 used systematic observation and surveys to look for factors related to parenting abilities of adolescent mothers. Participants completed a survey and they were videotaped engaged in different parenting activities. This information was used to make a more systematic comparisons, allowing for generalizations to be made about adolescents and their parenting abilities. Intensive interviewing, which is a qualitative method of finding out in depth about people's experiences, thoughts, and feelings in their own terms. It relies on open-ended questions. The goal is to develop a comprehensive picture, probe understandings, and engage interviewees in a dialogue about what they mean about their comments. In intensive interviewing, we must look for a saturation point, which refers to the point at which the interviews seem to offer any additional information. It's at that point we stop. And the last slide is focus groups. These are groups of unrelated individuals that are formed by the researcher and then led in group discussion of a topic of 1 to 2 hours. These are pretty typical within qualitative research. They do not involve representative samples, typically between 7 and 10 people. They're conducted at least several focus groups of the same topic to check for consistency of the findings. They're used to identify social service needs and utilization patterns.